The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 14th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello there and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme, Ukraine continues to launch attacks into Russian territory. We'll hear the latest on Kyiv's next steps. Also coming up,
自民党が変わることを示す最も分かりやすい最初の一歩は
we'll examine the economic impact of the Japanese Prime Minister's decision to step down. We'll hear the latest fashion and design news and the business headlines too. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. Ukraine has continued its bombardment of Russian territory near to its border. A second region of Belgorod has now declared a state of emergency and people are being evacuated from the area. Well, joining me now is Jenny Mathers, who's Senior Lecturer in International Politics at Aberystwyth University and a regular here on Monocle Radio. Good afternoon, Jenny.
Good afternoon.
So just bring us up to date. What is the latest on these events in Belgorod?
Well, it looks as though the regional governor of Belgorod has decided to take sort of advance action. He's concerned clearly that the Ukrainians are going to come across the border into his region, and so he's already evacuating people out. So I think it reveals that there's a lot of disquiet on the ground, even though Putin is trying to play it cool and present himself as totally in control and that this is nothing to worry about. The story from the people who are closest to the action is very, very different.
How much damage is this actually doing?
Well, that's not quite clear. I mean, we've had some photographs from the region which do show some damage to sort of buildings and so on. And certainly we've seen photographs of captured Russian soldiers who are being sort of held by the Ukrainians. But we haven't really seen, destruction on a large scale. So it seems that the Ukrainian forces have largely been able to go in without inflicting too much damage on the civilian population.
And how much damage is this doing also to the Russian offensive inside Ukraine? Because it is, one would imagine, diverting energy and troops away from their invasion.
Yes, and we are getting reports that Russia is starting to divert some of its troops from frontline areas of Ukraine back into Russia to try and deal with this incursion. The numbers so far don't seem to be very large, and so if the Ukrainians were hoping for a very sort of large-scale movement of troops, that certainly hasn't happened yet. But clearly, Russia is struggling to find a way of adequately responding to this incursion because their military forces are very stretched. They're struggling to recruit enough soldiers to continue to wage the war in Ukraine the way that they've been doing it, and clearly they have basically moved all the troops that they possibly could into Ukraine, leaving very little sort of on the ground to support the border, to ensure, the security of different locations within Russia itself. And now they're having to try and undo that a little bit and try and rush some troops from wherever they can find them to try and deal with this problem.
And the effect on Vladimir Putin and his decision and his plans for retaliation, I mean, what are they? Because clearly he has said that the retaliation will be significant, but one doesn't know what form that will take.
No, and he's fallen back on really very standard phraseology that we've heard not only from him but also from his Soviet predecessors about, appropriate retaliation and appropriate measures and so on. It's a way of being vague while still making the claims that there's going to be an interesting and significant response. He possibly doesn't yet know. And it sounds as though they've already started, pulling different troops together. They've started, trying to attack the Ukrainians, and apparently the Ukrainians have taken some casualties. So there have been, engagements. The Ukrainians haven't had it entirely their own way. But it's not really clear exactly what the strategy is going to be going forward, except doing more of the same. What we found in the past is that Russia is not very good at reacting quickly to unexpected events. They're much better at following a set plan, but having to kind of make plans on the hoof and try and adapt their strategy, that has not been a strong point. And so indeed, it seems to be that a week into this incursion by the Ukrainians, they're still not quite sure what they're doing.
Indeed, I mean, the Wall Street Journal is now reporting that Russia is having to withdraw some of its forces to respond to this. I mean, how is this going to go down in Russia? I mean, not least from the locals who are having to move, evacuate, flee their homes, but also in terms of the way that this is being viewed by Russians across the country.
Well, what's interesting is how visible and public this whole event is, because, although the state controls the media, there have nevertheless been sort of televised meetings between Putin and these regional officials, between Putin and his military leaders, where they've been discussing the situation. And Putin has sometimes chided the local regional governors for being too specific and giving too many numbers about what's happening. But it's clear that anybody watching Russian TV will understand there's something significant happening. There's a lot on social media in Russia, and as you say, thousands of people have been evacuated already. They're not very happy. They have friends and relatives, throughout Russia. So, the news is certainly getting out. It definitely sort of punctures Putin's balloon of saying, well, everything is fine, under control. We have your security sorted. You don't have to worry about anything like that, because now the war has come to them. And
if we broaden this out to the reaction from the international community, I mean, what in your view should that be? I mean, do we know what kind of and whose weapons the Ukrainians are using to sort of push through on this incursion into Russian territory? Because when you start to use international weapons to effectively cross the border in the other way, you start to change the rules and you start to change the situation a bit.
Yes, and I think that's what's so interesting, is that there are indications that they're using foreign supplied weapons, in this operation, but we haven't had the cries of outrage or anger from the countries that are supplying Ukraine with weaponry. It's been very muted, the response. And it's pretty clear that the Ukrainians decided to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. So they've gone ahead and done it almost certainly without waiting for the Western backers to give them permission. But the Western countries, and particularly the US, have been very blasé about it in public. And this is a really interesting potential turning point, because if this attitude continues, then some or maybe even all of the restrictions that the Ukrainians have complained about for a long time, about how the weapons can be used and where and so on, maybe those will be released or at least relaxed somewhat. So we could see this as being a really significant turning point in the conflict.
Jenny Mathers, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. The time here in London is 8 minutes past midday. Let's have a look now at the rest of today's stories. Here's Carlotta Rebello.
Thanks, Emma. The US Special Envoy for Sudan says US-mediated ceasefire talks are set to go ahead this week, despite pending confirmation of participation from the Sudanese army. The talks are set to begin in Geneva, co-hosted by Switzerland and Saudi Arabia. China has uncovered widespread corruption in its funeral services industry, including illegal harvesting, theft and resale of thousands of corpses. China has waged an all-out war on corruption in many industries from the start of the year, as part of a rigid, sweeping campaign pursued by President Xi Jinping since he took power in 2012. And Greek firefighters are continuing to battle a wildfire that spread to the north of Athens for a third day. The blaze has destroyed homes and businesses in the capital suburbs and forced the evacuation of thousands of people, including from 3 hospitals and a children's home. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much indeed, Carlotta. The time in Tokyo is 20:09, which is where we head next on the briefing, because let's hear more now on the announcement made by Japan's Prime Minister that he'll step down in September. Fumio Kishida's decision comes at a crucial moment for Japan as its economy emerges from decades-long campaign against deflation and low growth. While in Tokyo, joining me for more is Peter Landers, Tokyo Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal. A very good evening to you, Peter.
Good evening.
You've been covering this in the last few hours for the Wall Street Journal. Just explain to us, I mean, this is the Prime Minister saying that he's not seeking re-election as a party chief ruler. So that is effectively the de facto Prime Minister situation, Prime Minister's position. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. Traditionally in Japan, the head of the ruling party is simultaneously Prime Minister. And so custom, which is followed in pretty much every instance, says that when the ruling party selects a new president or leader, that person also almost immediately becomes prime minister. So what Fumio Kishida is saying today is that he will not try to be reelected as party leader, and as soon as a new party leader is selected, that person will also be selected by Parliament as Prime Minister.
Just explain to us a little bit what some of the reasons why he is going. There is a corruption scandal which he is having to address now, but there's also the fact that Japan's shaky economy has not done him any favours reputation-wise.
That's exactly right. I think the political funds kind of added to the economic unease, the political funds scandal, that is, added to the economic unease that many people in Japan are feeling, with inflation being at 3 or even 4% briefly, which people haven't experienced here for decades. And it's not nearly as bad as you saw, for example, in the UK or the US, other parts of the world during and after the pandemic, but still it feels unsettling.
And just tell us, how that is being felt in real terms by Japanese. I mean, we have visitors to Japan have been enjoying a very weak yen, but that obviously has a major impact on the price of imports into Japan. How much of this this actually been felt by the Japanese?
It's been felt by me. I'm not Japanese, but I've lived here for quite a while now, and just prices that had not changed for 20, 30 years since I first moved here in the early 1990s, all of a sudden have been going up, especially, as you said, imports. Food, a lot of food in Japan is imported. The price of gas has gone up, and of course that gasoline, that is, and that affects other things like taxi rides or just any product that requires electricity is also based on imported natural gas and coal in many instances. So you see prices going up that had not changed for a very long time. And at the same time, wages are also going up, but not quite as much as prices until recently, at least. And so for, I think, 27 straight months under Prime Minister Kishida, real wages adjusted for inflation were going down. And so it's really no wonder, if you consider that statistic, that he was not very popular.
And also, in terms of the way that the Japanese stock market has functioned, it's done pretty well under Fumio Kishida, as you've written about earlier on today in the Wall Street Journal. But that hasn't really been felt by Japanese.
That's right. Only about 1 in 8 households in Japan owns stock. So earlier this year, the Nikkei stock average hit a record for the first time in more than 34 years. There was a little bit of turbulence last week, but actually it's recovered back. So if you've invested in stocks at any time over the last 5-10 years, you've made a lot of money, whether foreign or Japanese. But most people don't own any stock at all. So it really doesn't mean a lot to them. I think if investors could have voted, Kishida might be more popular.
Now, tell us a little bit more about the way that this now places Japan, given the fact that it will go into a period of political turbulence at a moment which, as I said before, is crucial for Japan and its long-term economic recovery, but also militarily as well. It is sort of strengthening its position in the region. To place Japan now in a position of uncertainty, what do you imagine the effect will be?
I actually don't think there will be all that much uncertainty. If you look at the candidates who are likely to run to succeed Prime Minister Kishida, they're all standard issue, you might say, conservative, centrist conservative members of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. We don't have, as you see, for example, in France or Germany, some sort of far-right party coming up and threatening to disrupt the system or bring about more radical change. Nor is there any chance of a leftist party taking control right away, although they might have a chance in future national elections. But any of the people who are likely to take over will be pro-U.S. They're going to support the defense buildup that started under the late Prime Minister Abe, continued under Prime Minister Kishida. They're going to try to continue the reconciliation with South Korea. And their biggest task, I think, will be getting along well with the next U.S. president. We don't know if it'll be Harris or Trump, but the U.S. will have a new president as of January, and Japan will have a new prime minister. That's the most important relationship for Japan to foster.
Peter Landers in Tokyo, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing. Let's hear a business roundup now. I'm delighted to say Victoria Scholar, Head of Investment at Interactive Investor, joins me now. Good afternoon, Victoria.
Afternoon.
News breaking about UK inflation.
Yeah, so we got the annual rate of inflation for the UK this morning, and it came in at 2.2% in July. A lot of the headlines talking about the fact that it rose from 2% in May and June, and that it was the first increase since December. But actually, the figure was a bit better than many had anticipated. Analysts had penciled in a rise to 2.3%. The monthly figure also beat expectations. And then if we look at the services sector inflation rate, that came in a lot lower than anticipated. So that's why we saw that the pound moved a bit lower against the US dollar. And some of the house builder stocks on the FTSE 100, like Persimmon and Barratt Developments and Taylor Wimpey, all jumping to the top of the FTSE 100 in anticipation that this could potentially pave the way for some rate cuts around the corner.
Indeed. I mean, I think many people are now saying that the Bank of England is most likely to cut rates again in September. Would you agree on that likelihood?
So the markets are pricing in about a 45% chance of another 25 basis point cut next month. So about 50-50 at the moment. But that's up quite considerably from what markets were pricing in before today's data. So the fact that inflation came in lower than expected provides some wiggle room for the central bank to be a bit more aggressive in terms of cutting rates. I think markets are anticipating another 2 cuts to interest rates in 2024, which would take the bank rate down from 5% where it is currently to 4.5% by the end of the year. But of course, a lot depends on what we see in terms of the inflation and other data points between now and then.
And what about other countries when it comes to inflation? Because inflation has risen here in the United Kingdom, but it is still lower than other major European economies such as France and Germany.
Yes, that's right. And also the United States, where we're waiting key data on inflation just in an hour or so. Inflation there is expected to come in at 3%. So we can see that we're doing a bit better on the inflation stakes than other economies around the world.
Let's move on to the United States. We've seen the stock markets be absolutely spooked in the last couple of weeks about a fading confidence in the United States' economic outlook. There is now talk of the R word, recession, in the US. I mean, how has that come about when all the figures and all the narrative that has been coming from the US has pointed towards success?
Yeah, so the last couple of years, we've seen that the US has really outperformed in terms of the economic data. Growth has been a lot stronger than predicted. But just a week ago, we had some pretty weak US jobs numbers. We saw a spike in the unemployment rate, and that's really raised concerns about the risk of a recession stateside. And as you say, it's spark this bout of market volatility. Analysts on Wall Street, for example, are now suggesting there's a growing risk of a US recession. Goldman Sachs is assigning a 41% probability over the next year. JP Morgan saying there's about a 31% chance, which is up quite a lot from a 20% chance at the end of March. But perhaps a lot of this is to do with the fact that the Federal Reserve has waited a long time to start cutting interest rates. At the beginning of the year, we thought that the Fed was going to be cutting across 2024, starting in about March. But we're heading into or getting close to September now, and the Fed still hasn't cut interest rates. So I think we could be in for a bumper rate cut at some point, possibly in September, to try and kickstart the economy and provide some kind of calm to the markets again.
It's difficult to create calm when the United States is in the run-up to a major political time of uncertainty with the elections. I mean, what kind of effect does that have?
Well, it's interesting because I think that Joe Biden hasn't really been given that much credit for the fact that the economy has been doing really well. And Trump has been talking about a Kamala crash and obviously blaming her for the fact that we've seen this bout of volatility. But I'd say rather than the politics, it's a lot more to do with the monetary policy and the fact that interest rates are quite high at the moment. So that makes borrowing that much more expensive and can make business loans more expensive as well.
Victoria Scholar, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing. Let's talk fashion now. Rebecca Tay is a retail expert and brand consultant who joins me in the studio now. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much.
Lovely
Emma.
to see you. Right, let's talk about the departure of big names from big brands. Let's focus on Tom Ford. We had Peter Hawkins going a few weeks ago. Yes. Tell us more about that.
It's quite an interesting one because I think Peter Hawkins was it was a natural step up. He was very public about the fact that he had been groomed for the role for quite a while. He worked under Tom Ford for 2 decades. So, it was no surprise when he was brought into that role once the brand was sold to Estée Lauder. But less than a year or just over a year later, he's exited. So, of course, the brand's sort of official statement was that a successor would be announced soon. But in the 3 weeks since, nothing has come about. Maybe call it July, August kind of quiet news, but maybe they're waiting for September to release an announcement, or maybe they don't actually know who it's going to be yet.
Do we know why he went?
Do you know what? I think there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of speculation and discussion about why. He had big shoes to fill. Tom Ford, obviously, it's his own brand, but he was quite a powerhouse in the sense that he was very involved. He was sort of a public figure, or not even he was definitely a public figure. There have been a lot of change at the brand as well. So on the beauty side of things, there have been changes in how they marketed certain things. So there's kind of an anecdote or a story about Tom Ford releasing a perfume called Effing Fabulous. I'm not sure if we can swear on this program, but and then in later years they released one called Vanilla Sex, which had not the same impact as under the Tom Ford years. It was kind of considered as a bit bland, a bit of a watered down version of the impact that he had. So it's a bit unfair to blame that specifically on Peter Hawking, but that's kind of one of the examples of how he just wasn't really living up to those expectations of him.
You can't leave an entire brand just because Vanilla Sex was a bit vanilla. The interesting thing, though, is that we now have we have a really small pool of talent in the world of fashion now, don't we? And people have moved around a lot in the last couple of years.
Yes.
So where do they start hunting for their next head?
It's a good point. I think they sort of look at who's out there. There's a lot of speculation about people like Heider Ackerman, for example. They look at who's a right fit for a brand. As I said, it's quite a big brand to fill because there's the big beauty business. It's now owned by Estée Lauder, which is one of the biggest conglomerates. So there's a lot of financial pressure. So somebody who can kind of respond to that and really live up to the expectations of something like that as well. Tom Ford also has the ready-to-wear businesses. So obviously it's fashion sides, so women's ready-to-wear, as well as a huge suiting business. And that side of the business is owned, or it's a partnership with Zegna. So a lot of pressure in that sense as well. So somebody who can really deliver fashion, beauty, cologne, branding. So as I said, Tom Ford really had that kind of magnetic presence. He was a personality in himself. So somebody who is either able to fill those shoes or take a different approach and be quite confident about it, I think.
Okay, let's talk about the Olympics. And the fact was that there were different success stories, weren't there? That we had amazing success stories from the sporting brands which sponsored athletes. So you had, last week in Paris, we were talking to people from On Running, from Puma, from New Balance, On Running and Puma especially, having their names on the kit that was worn by people who got gold.
Yes.
I mean, what's the kind of the afterglow of that?
I think, as you said, it's the sort of gold medal winners, because those pictures of people on the podium wearing, a Fila tracksuit, for example, those will live on forever. We'll always look at those photos and we'll remember that athlete was wearing that brand. So those are key moments that I think will live on. The other sporting brands that have done well, so Nike, they've faced other challenges, I think, in recent months. Their sort of overall brand value has gone down. However, they are still the key sponsor. So I think there was one statistic that said that every American athlete that was on the podium was wearing Nike. So whether it's gold medal, silver medal, bronze medal, they were wearing Nike. Their shoes were all over the athletics field. So they were definitely a big presence. But as for the other brands, I think LVMH kind of had the monopoly. So they, Louis Vuitton, they presented the medals on these, monogrammed trays. They really had the monopoly of kind of the fashion in the Olympics generally.
They seem to have the monopoly of the city, though. Everywhere you look, LVMH's billboards are bigger than anybody else's.
100%. And in the industry, I think I would say as well. So they're the kind of key player.
Where do we think that will go? Because there was quite a lot of discussion during the Olympics about the fact that if you are an athlete, and especially arguably if you are a woman, there is an enormous potential there now for you to put your name to something enormous. And the discussions that, are centred around the idea of which brand is going to go and create the women's equivalent of an Air Jordan or a Stan Smith or something like that. I mean, there is a ripe moment now, isn't there, for, the easy example is the Simone Biles leotard, but there is that moment, isn't there, that the Olympics can capitalise on?
Yeah, definitely. I think, as you said, there is that Simone Biles, the leotard moment. I think it was GK Sport or GK. It was a very specific leotard brand. So the fact that the Olympic gymnastics team actually still went for a brand that's known specifically for creating leotards is telling in itself. They didn't go for, a Nike or a Lululemon or something else like that. But as you said, there was a key moment. We were all looking at Simone Biles. I think what came about was her makeup. So there was images of her, holding Fenty Beauty palettes. A lot of commentary on how her makeup looked amazing and impeccable, even after doing all those twists and turns in the air. She just looked spotless and stunning. And then there was a lot of focus on nails. I think especially with the American team as well. So Sherika Richardson, I think her name is, with the nail art, along with some of the British athletes. So it feels like it's kind of dipping a toe in, but as you said, there's more opportunity. So we looked at Zendaya, who's an on-running ambassador, but she obviously is not an athlete. So she's not an athlete, exactly. So how else can the athletes themselves be capitalising on that?
Finally, one very, very quick question, because we've run out of time. Dolce & Gabbana has launched a perfume for dogs. Dogs have an astonishing sense of smell. How good an idea is this?
I think if you ask the RSPCA and any vet, they would say it's a terrible idea, and they are actually quite outraged, I think, about this. It's not surprising. Dolce & Gabbana are known for sort of inciting controversy sometimes when it comes to product launches. It's called Fefe, and it's not a cheap perfume either. I think it's, just under £100. But obviously, yes, as you said, dogs are known for their sense of smell. So sort of attaching a human attribute like a scent to them is just a terrible idea, I think.
Rebecca Tay, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. The time here in London is 12:27 and you're listening to The Briefing. You're back with The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. Let's look now further at the creative scene with the design writer Samantha T, who's a writer, editor and consultant. A very good afternoon to you, Samantha.
Hello, good afternoon. How are you?
Very good to hear your voice. Now tell us what's happening at Amsterdam Fashion Week.
Well, Amsterdam Fashion Week is happening the first, week of September. And what I think is really interesting is they're going to have the unveiling of a new installation called the Vondel Foundation Stacked, which is a collaboration between Sabine Marcellus for Solid Nature. And I think what's really great is that this installation is going to be using reused stone it's reusing blue onyx from the entrance, from the award-winning Beyond the Surface installation, which Solid Nature won an award for in Salone in 2023. And I guess what I love most about this Vondel fountain is that it's in Vondel Park, which is sort of like Amsterdam's answer to Bryant Park in New York. So it's a centralized location where a lot of the fashion brands will be presenting their work. And so this will be unveiled on September 5th, and I think it's going to be absolutely stunning. And it's a great way to really draw in, a broader audience to art and design, but also to fashion. So I think that's really incredible.
And that use of repurposing stone, how much of a thing is this at the moment now to reuse and repurpose?
I think sustainability is a really, really big topic across design. It doesn't matter what discipline. I think the idea of reusing, previously used materials is very big right now. So I think it's going to be great to see how something that was, had once won an award a year ago is now being repurposed into a new installation.
Let's talk about that sort of reuse as well. Going back to Paris, and let's look at the Eiffel Tower. Originally seen as a temporary exhibition, now far from temporary. It is what many say visually defines Paris. One thing that we saw in the last couple of weeks was the beautiful big balloon, the cauldron, that kept the Olympic flame burning in the Jardin des Tuileries for 2 weeks. So beloved that tickets for it sold out in a second. And now there's a thought that actually, like the Eiffel Tower, this balloon, the cauldron, should stay.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea that, something that similar to the Eiffel Tower has the possibility of staying even longer and becoming, an icon of the city alongside the Eiffel Tower. If you look at a lot of photos, not just professionals have taken, but across, Instagram, people who have TikToked it, you see this iconic cauldron, which is so symbolic of the Olympics and now has become such an iconic part of the city. I think that there's the petition to try to keep it around is going to be fantastic.
I mean, who's going to say no?
Well, there you go.
Let's stay with France and the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. There's an exhibition of Christophe. Explain who Christophe is and what the Maison's purpose is of this exhibition.
Okay. Well, first of all, the Maison des Arts Décoratifs is amazing. It's a space right by the Louvre that specializes, of course, in decorative arts. Now, I guess the Maison is the first sort of, this exhibition is the first of its kind for this Maison. It boasts nearly 200 years of history, dating back to the 1830s. And it's got really great, talented goldsmiths and collaborations. So everyone from Karl Lagerfeld to Pharrell Williams to Gio Ponti. It's a really artistic sort of brand that encompasses both the French craftsmanship and also its dedication to design. So what I love most that's going to be here is that, we were talking about the World Fair in the Eiffel Tower. There were teaspoons and monumental vases from the World Fair. And, I think close to 1,000 pieces of gold and silver work, ranging from jewelry and painting and drawings and so forth, that really highlight the extraordinary heritage of the company.
Samantha, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of The Briefing. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producer Tom Webb. Our researcher was Gunnar Gronlid and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.